Ever seen one of those viral videos where an artist is effortlessly blending juicy and vibrant markers? And so because you're an impressionable young artist, you go out, spend a fortune on these trendy alcohol markers that everyone's talking about. Your markers finally arrive, so you get your sketchbook out, start drawing, and now it's time to test these bad boys out. And the ink's muddied from the graphite, the page is bled through, and the colours aren't even blending. Well, don't worry, because I'm here to help you out. I've been using alcohol markers since at least 14 years old back in 2017. 8 years and over 1,000 drawings later, I like to think I've learnt and picked up a few tricks for colouring along the way. In my previous video, I went over the essential colours for buying my favourite brand of markers, which is Copic. So now we'll be going over my top tips for actually using them so that you don't have to make the same mistakes that I did when I started. Oh, and one more thing, don't forget to like, subscribe and hit all the buttons because we are going hard on YouTube this year. First things first, remember to use a smooth surface, and before we get into the main drawing, let's go over the basics of the most important feature that separates alcohol markers, and that's the blending. There are two main nibs that you'll find depending on the marker, the first being the chisel tip, which is great for large areas, but my personal favourite, and one that I use 99% of the time, is the brush tip, because of its versatility, and you can get nice line width variation, and it makes blending a whole lot easier. To achieve the best results, I'd recommend using 3 markers of the same colour with a light, medium and dark value. You can either start with the lightest colour or the darkest. In this case, I'm filling in the area with the lightest colour, then I'll take a darker colour and fill in any areas with a shadow, and then I'll go back to the first marker and go over where the two colours meet, either in a back and forth motion or a swirly motion. And if I want to go darker, I'll do the same thing with an even darker marker, and I can keep layering because I started off light. To work from dark to light, it's as easy as just doing everything there in reverse.
Don't try to understand it.
Another way to blend is using a feathering technique where you flick the marker up over the other colour. You can do this for blending different colours, but I'd recommend testing them on a spare sheet just to make sure it's the effect you want, because if the colours are too different, they can end up looking dull. A great way to check if colours are compatible is looking at how close they are on the colour wheel. The further away from each other, the harder they will be to blend. Alcohol markers are transparent like watercolour, so you can easily mix them to create specific colours. So let's say I want an olive green, I'll take my generic green and layer it with yellow to create the colour that I want. With the basics out of the way, before you go in with your markers, you need something to actually colour. So if you're doing a comic illustration, you can use any waterproof ink to create the line work. I don't normally recommend colouring over pencil because it can muddy your markers, but it can be useful for a more realistic style, and in that case I would suggest you use a kneaded eraser to pick up most of the graphite. By the way, all my art supplies are linked on my website. One last thing to remember is before you start, swatch out all the colours that you'll be using to make sure they are the right ones and that they blend well with each other. Depending on the brand, the colour of the ink can be quite different from the marker's cap. To give you an example of a swatch, for this piece I'm using 2 main colours, green and orange. So I've got my light greens, my light oranges, middle range greens, middle range oranges, and darker, more saturated greens and oranges. But I'm also using greys and other contrasting colours for things like highlights and rim lights, etc. So now that I've got my outlines, I'm treating it like painting in layers, as if it was watercolours, working from light to dark. To fill in large areas, you can use the chisel tip, and this end of the marker is often lighter because ink doesn't flow as juicy. But if you're filling in an area and it looks patchy or streaky, it's probably because you're going too fast. Move the marker slowly to let the ink flow for a much smoother result. So I'm starting with my lightest colour first and slowly building up the value, because you can always go darker, but it's harder to go light. Since alcohol ink spreads quickly, a tip for avoiding colouring over the lines is to create a barrier within the line using a light touch before filling in the area. But if you do make a mistake, that's where your colourless blender comes in handy. It can lighten colours to a degree, and if you go over your outline, you can often lighten it by literally pushing the ink back using the colourless blender in a forward motion. A bonus tip for the colourless blender is to prime the page with it before blending colours for an even more seamless blend. Another tip is to colour in similar areas at the same time. You'll notice that I'm not really going back and forth with my colours, and instead I'm doing them in batches, like all of Hulk's green skin at once. This will create a more consistent and smooth look. My next tip is to leave areas where the light hits so that we can see the white of the page. Sometimes less is more, and you can achieve a subtle blend into the blank page with any colour by just flicking the marker up, and the colourless blender helps here too. So you've coloured everything in, but it's still looking a bit flat and a bit like Skittles. Well, that's because you need to add shadow with a grey, and not just a darker colour, so always have your light source in mind. Warm light casts cooler shadows and cool light casts warmer shadows, and the most common light source is the sun, which casts warm light, so you're going to want to reach to your cool greys to provide realistic shading, or at least a sense of realistic shading. Of course, rules are meant to be broken, so if you want to get a little funky with your light and shadows, you can experiment with different colours for highlights and shading. I'll sometimes do an orange or teal rim light or even purple shading because I think it complements skin tones, but that's for you to have fun and experiment with. Bonus tip is to try to reuse certain colours throughout your piece to create a sense of harmony. Now this is more to do with colour theory, but as you can see here, I used a yellow undertone for both the Hulk and the Thing. It just makes it feel like they're both in the same space. Now, for the finishing touches, I often go in with a white gel pen to add the most intense highlights like the eyes, where you'd want to draw the most attention, or to make surfaces look extra shiny, like metal, for example. And my final tip is to combine your art mediums. Don't just stop with markers, experiment with other stuff over the top like colouring pencils or Poscas, or even watercolours and acrylics, because they all layer over incredibly well. And often you'll see other artists using markers just to create a flat base for them to colour over the top with. At the end of the day, this is just how I use alcohol markers, and everyone has their own way of working. So there's no right or wrong, the only rule is to have fun whilst using them. One quick warning about alcohol markers is that they aren't very light fast, which means if you leave them out in sunlight, they will start to fade. So make sure once you're done with your piece, put it in an archival box or just keep it away from sunlight. And that should keep the colours looking fresh. So there you have it. Let me know if you found this helpful and comment what you want to see next from this channel. See you later.